This is what inspired one of my poem, The Sanctuary, in my collection, the Eddy Fence. In the fall of 2001, I was deeply in mourning. My mother had died a few months earlier, followed by the catastrophic events of 9/11. And then Weyerhaeuser began clear-cutting the forest on the hillside directly across the road from our home, which was in the foothills of the Coast Range between Monmouth and Corvallis area. And I remember as I watched those 40-foot tall Doug firs lean to the left and fall, as is one of the lines in the poems, the images of the Twin Towers and of all the life that they contained were still fresh in my mind, and I felt really just quite overwhelmed by both the grief that I was trying to bear of my own personally and by all the suffering that there is in the world to bear. And I just began really kind of intuitively just trying to write into the pain of that, not so much expressing something as just directly using language to, I guess, to enter it more deeply is the best way I can describe it. And by writing into it rather than trying to kind of capture it and reduce it, I guess, or even find meaning, what I found was that the question took on more of its complexities, and the poem gave back its own kind of answer that has actually been a kind of talisman for me over time, is having to do with maybe the ways in which we are asked to open ourselves more in the presence of more pain, to enlarge the heart. So it wasn't so much a solution there, but it was definitely an answer. The Sanctuary. It was late when I walked up the gravel road to the clear-cut hill. Loggers gone for the day, feller buncher machines all still, their claws and blades cooling. A low sun laid its thick light on the slope. The light sieved through the last lean stand. Into those wrecked woods I walked, straight to the center pile, laid myself down on a log, and apologized for my species. I apologized to those trees for my species with tears, but not without greed. I wanted a word in turn of forgiveness, reassurance, I don't know. I wanted a word, which didn't come. And what was I thinking? Wanting more? The trees, after all, were dead. The trees were dead. Only the light was there, which I saw as I stood between the machines and their gruesome business, amid the piles and vines, coated the whole sorry mess of us all, without chastisement or preference. Without chastisement or preference, the light left, and I walked back down that road and up my own, home to a solitude I was bereft of now, sullied as it was. Woke the next day to watch over again one fir after another lean to the left and fall, keening and cracking. Screamers, the painter Emily Carr had called them, final splinters that shriek as the trunk is torn. For so long, oh, forever, I had counted on the forest's persistence there, its green and cool surround, not to escape the sufferings of the world, from which to bear them. Now the violence was taking the forest too, while I stood on my cedar deck, inconsolable, seeing unceasingly. Inconsolable, seeing unceasingly, a word arrived through the wound. This is what it is to bear witness. I saw inside. As the woods got small, the heart had to grow larger, to become, by its breaking, what those woods had been. Spacious, the heart would have to become, and huge, enough to hold all the trees and their absence, and every other thing. I'm noticing as I read that, and it's, I guess, kind of an example of what I am reminded again and again that poetry can do, is that the discovery of that, the lesson of it, enters my body again. And there's something about the reading it out loud that does that. You know, there are poems I think that are meant to enter from just the page, but so much of what happens is about the way language enters the body and becomes part of the body. So as I read it, as I read it just now, it was like it was new to me, you know. And,
it's like you feel the hurt again.
Feel it again. Yeah, hurt again, and the opening feeling of, with breath, opening the heart again. I actually grew up in a family of writers. My parents did different things professionally, but my mom was a journalist and my dad was a journalist, and they wrote other kinds of things also. All of my siblings are, all four of them, and we kind of, I think, I've realized recently, kind of come from generations of people to whom language was really important. I also grew up in a family that spent a lot of time in the woods, in the mountains, from the time I was really quite young. My dad worked for the Forest Service for a period of time, and had some kind of amazing adventures, and really taught us to love the mountains and everything that lived in them. So that was also part of my own childhood and kind of infused in me over time. I'm a psychotherapist by profession, and really kind of discovered the two, poetry and psychotherapy, as my two main loves at about the same time. And there are ways in which they have kind of woven together over time. But I think I find my deepest nourishment by being out in nature, and have found language to be a way of actually connecting. I know for some people language is amazing. It can abstract us from the world, and it can connect us with the world. And for me, it's become a way of deepening my connection with the world and with the body. So, as has psychotherapy. So I've been a psychotherapist for about 30 years, and maybe writing for 40. I had been taking classes at Western Oregon University, so I'm not sure where I wanted to go actually with college, but I decided to take a creative writing course in poetry. I think I was just curious about it, because I had not read that much poetry or written that much, but I was curious about it. And I was lucky enough to be in a class with the now retired Jim Slauson. And I don't remember what his process was, but I remember that I sort of wrote some of the dumb stuff that is sort of imagining that what poetry was writing about dramatic emotions in elevated language and uneven margins. And then I had the experience of it was in a gym class, and being in the showers with a bunch of other women, very, very bodily experience, and just having the sense that there was a perception that I was having that I felt like I wanted to bring to language. And I sat down and I started writing in what felt like a very different way. It was like being in a spell of language, where the process of trying to put words to just the pure perception, not what I thought about something or not what I felt about it, but in a way it was, I think, as I've reflected on it over the past 40 years, that very galvanizing moment, it was as though I discovered how language could take me out of my head and more deeply into the world. Because I just started looking for what are the words that are this thing that I am seeing. And I went back and looked at that poem a few weeks ago, and it's pretty good in the sense, not so much that it's a really good poem, but that's a poem. And I feel like that was the first poem. It, again, was like being in a spell, but I felt like in writing, in using language in that way, I went from being, in a way, outside of an experience to fully inside that experience. And then I sort of stepped back and thought, whoa. And then I took it to class, and Jim Slauson, he saw that and said, yeah, this is really a poem. And then I feel like I've spent the next 40 years trying to do that again. And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I sort of bring too much intention to it. But that was really the moment where I discovered the language of poetry. I guess that was it, and was kind of captured by it, how it felt as though it took me more deeply into the world. That just feels increasingly urgent to me. And while we do also use language to abstract, to distance from the world, and one of the great things that is very painful for me is to watch the ways these days in which language is used, actually is misused, is abused, in order to make it possible for us to distance others, to make it possible for us to do violence, actually, by using words and it's because words are so powerful. It's because they're so powerful that when they are used in a certain way, they are absolutely misused and allow us to distance from others, to distance from the land, to other people, and to somehow make it okay for us to do great destruction and to ignore our responsibility and to distance ourselves, really. And so the great gift, and I feel like urgency, of poetry is to take us, is to reduce that distance again, to take us more deeply into felt relationship with each other, to cross what feel like gaps or boundaries in our experience as humans and our experience as humans with the rest of the world. And by way of that, I think that takes us into healing. It takes us into healing at a level that is much deeper, more direct than through ideology, even. I feel like you can, yeah, I can go on and on about that, but that is, I guess that's what I would say, is that they're all kind of one for me. I have found myself using the term, I don't know that I've heard it, but I feel it, the erotics of language. in a relationship, an erotic relationship is a deeply felt bodily one, and when we enter into poetry, to me, is a practice of being in an erotic relationship with language that in turn takes us into the realm of eros, through which we recognize our aliveness, and the aliveness that we are a part of the aliveness of everything. So. Poetry and psychotherapy have kind of been two tracks in a way, the two vocations that have been in a way parallel. And over the years, they have come together in what feels like a braided kind of stream. So the way that I incorporate poetry into therapy more has to do with, it's the same quality of attention. I bring the kind of curiosity that I bring to poetry, I try to bring to therapy. I try to not so much figure things out as refresh my curiosity. Poetry began to bring me out of my head and into my body. And so through that, it's been a kind of reflexive thing, is that the challenge for me in psychotherapy has been to come out of my head and into my body and be there with people and not to go back up into my head. So in that way, it's like they've kind of become more and more a braided stream. Some people use poetry in a more sort of explicit way with clients to, invite them to write poetry. All that. I'm not one of those people, and it's only because I think it is so embedded in the process of doing therapy itself that it's hard for me to sort of extricate it as a practice and say, here, maybe do this. I also am not real directive in that way, but therapy informs my poetry, poetry informs therapy very much. And in a way, I guess I would say that the practice of poetry has hopefully helped me become a better therapist. Yeah, my very favorite place to write is, I definitely do my best writing if I'm in some kind of a natural environment. I used to write at a no longer existing Jesuit retreat center on the coast, Nestucca Sanctuary. The sanctuary still exists, but the retreat center doesn't. My absolute favorite place is Playa, a retreat center down on Summer Lake. And I've had 2 long retreats there. So grateful for the time and the space to be there, like month-long retreats. And the second time I went, I think I was so attuned to just sort of knowing that, that is the place for my body to write, that I hadn't been able to write for probably, I don't think I'd written a poem for months and months. And I wondered if there was still a there, and I started down into the sort of final curves down into that area, and language literally just started to flow. I had to pull over a couple of times to just write stuff down. There's something about that area. And what I think particularly makes it a particularly perfect place for me is that Great Basin area is such liminal space. The sense that sometimes the lake is the lake, or maybe it's mud, or maybe it's dry and shiny, and maybe it is the horizon you see, or maybe it's more lake and the sky and clouds. Everything seems so in flux and so uncertain, and so very much in relation with each other in a kind of a flow of ways that it takes me to that place that is the liminal space inside from which poetry comes for me. So I get there as much as I can. Poems that I wrote at Playa at Summer Lake in the Great Basin is entitled that. In the Great Basin, first day of spring. The storm smashes the marsh grasses, whips up the willows, crochets, then unravels the lake's glossy lace. Snow whirls in billows of rice-like noise. Steel roofs thunder on their rafters. When it dies, in the silence, mourning doves wearing noon's aureoles coo by the chicken coop. The soul tenses against both the wind and the stillness, unsure of its nature. Is it a mouse in the marsh grass? That little alkali island in the wide gray lake? Or is it the grass, the lake?